The piercing wail of emergency sirens shattered the morning calm across 3 states as federal agents descended on the Trans-Canada pipeline with military precision. Gas stations from Texas to Montana began shuttering their pumps within hours. Digital signs flashing the dreaded words that would send shockwaves through American households: no fuel available. The crisis that would grip the nation for weeks had begun with a single phone call. A woman's trembling voice claiming imminent catastrophe. "This is Karen Whitfield with Pinnacle Energy Solutions," the voice had said to the 911 dispatcher just 6 hours earlier. "I have credible intelligence that a domestic terrorist named Jalen Crawford is planning to detonate explosives along the primary pipeline corridor. Lives are at stake. You need to act now." But 12 hours before that call, Jalen Crawford had been doing something entirely different. He stood on the steps of the Federal Energy Building in downtown Houston, his voice carrying across a crowd of 200 peaceful protesters holding signs demanding renewable energy investment. The morning sun cast long shadows across their faces as they chanted slogans about clean air and sustainable futures. Jalen's dark skin glistened with perspiration, his natural charisma drawing even passers-by to pause and listen. "We're not here to destroy," he called out, his deep voice resonating through the megaphone. "We're here to build, to demand that our government invests in the technologies that will save this planet for our children." The crowd erupted in supportive cheers, their energy infectious and purposeful. Among the office workers watching from across the street stood Karen Whitfield, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the light as she observed through designer sunglasses. At 42, she had spent the last decade climbing the corporate ladder at various energy firms. Her current position as Director of Strategic Communications at Pinnacle Energy Solutions, representing the pinnacle of her career. Her manicured fingers tapped against her phone as she recorded video of the demonstration, her expression calculating rather than concerned. Jalen's speech continued with passionate conviction. "The science is clear. The climate crisis demands immediate action. Every day we delay transitioning to renewable energy is another day we mortgage our children's future for corporate profits." His words carried the weight of genuine concern, backed by his doctorate in environmental engineering from MIT and years of grassroots organizing across the country. Karen made several phone calls that afternoon, her voice crisp and professional as she spoke with colleagues and industry contacts. To anyone listening, she was simply coordinating public relations responses to the protest. But her true intentions were far more sinister, involving a complex web of market manipulation that would soon unfold with devastating consequences. The first signs of Karen's plan emerged that evening when she arrived at a storage facility on the outskirts of Houston. Using her security clearance from previous energy sector work, she accessed materials that would later become central to the unfolding crisis. Her movements were methodical and practiced, suggesting this was not her first foray into such activities. By dawn, the next morning, Karen had positioned herself as the concerned whistleblower, placing the call that would set everything in motion. Her performance was Oscar-worthy as she described fictional meetings, invented bomb plots, and painted Jalen as a dangerous radical bent on destruction. The emergency response was swift and overwhelming. Within 30 minutes of Karen's call, federal agents had surrounded Jalen's modest apartment in 3rd Ward, Houston. The sound of helicopters circling overhead mixed with the sharp commands of tactical teams as they breached his door. Jalen, who had been preparing breakfast and reviewing notes for his upcoming presentation at the University of Houston, found himself face down on his kitchen floor with zip-tie restraints cutting into his wrists. "What is this about?" he demanded, his voice muffled against the linoleum. "I have rights. I want to call my lawyer." "You're under investigation for domestic terrorism," the lead agent replied curtly, Specifically, planned attacks against critical energy infrastructure. The absurdity of the accusation would have been laughable under different circumstances. Jalen's apartment was filled with academic journals, renewable energy research, and photos from peaceful protests and educational workshops. His computer contained presentations about solar panel efficiency and wind farm development, not bomb-making instructions or terrorist manifestos. But Karen's fabricated evidence proved devastatingly effective. She had doctored photographs showing suspicious packages near pipeline access points, created fake social media posts suggesting violent intentions, and even produced recordings of supposed planning meetings that had never occurred. Her years in corporate communications had taught her exactly how to craft compelling narratives, and she applied those skills with ruthless efficiency. The pipeline shutdown began immediately, as federal authorities took no chances with potential attacks on critical infrastructure. The Trans-Canada Pipeline carried over 3 million barrels of oil daily, supplying refineries across the Midwest and South. When the valves closed and the pumps stopped, the ripple effects spread like wildfire through the nation's energy grid. Gas stations began running dry within hours. The first shortages appeared in smaller towns along the pipeline route, but soon spread to major metropolitan areas as panic buying and hoarding exacerbated the supply crisis. Lines of cars stretched for blocks around still operating stations, with tempers flaring and fights breaking out as desperation mounted. "I've got a job interview tomorrow," shouted Marcus Thompson, a construction worker who had been waiting in line for 3 hours. "If I can't get there because there's no gas, I'm screwed. This is insane." The human cost mounted rapidly. Emergency services faced critical shortages as ambulances and fire trucks competed for limited fuel supplies. Delivery trucks sat idle, threatening food distribution networks. Airlines began canceling flights as jet fuel became scarce. The economic impact reached into the billions within the first week. Meanwhile, Jalen remained in federal custody, despite his lawyer's repeated motions for release. Sarah Martinez, a civil rights attorney with decades of experience fighting government overreach, struggled against a system determined to paint her client as a clear and present danger. "My client is a respected academic and peaceful activist," she argued before federal Judge Williams. "There's not one shred of legitimate evidence connecting him to any violent plans. This entire case appears to be built on fabricated evidence and racial profiling." Judge Williams, under pressure from federal prosecutors claiming national security implications, denied bail pending further investigation. The decision sent chills through activist communities nationwide, as the precedent became clear accusations alone could now result in indefinite detention without trial. Karen watched the unfolding chaos from her corner office at Pinnacle Energy Solutions, where stock prices and commodity futures flashed across multiple monitors. Oil prices had spiked 30% in 5 days, generating massive profits for her firm's portfolio. Her boss, CEO Richard Blackwood, couldn't contain his satisfaction as their quarterly projections soared beyond all expectations. "Outstanding work managing this crisis, Karen," he said during their morning briefing. "Your media strategy has positioned us perfectly to capitalize on market volatility. The board is impressed." Karen smiled demurely, hiding her knowledge that she had created the very crisis she was supposedly managing. Her manipulation extended beyond simple market timing. She had used her insider knowledge to place strategic investments weeks before her false accusations, positioning Pinnacle Energy Solutions and several partner firms to profit enormously from the artificial scarcity she had engineered. But cracks in Karen's elaborate deception began appearing sooner than she anticipated. Dr. Amanda Chen, a digital forensics expert working with Jalen's legal team, noticed inconsistencies in the metadata of the photographs Karen had provided to authorities. The timestamps didn't match the claimed dates, and the image compression patterns suggested heavy digital manipulation. These photos have been extensively altered, Dr. Chen explained to Sarah Martinez as they reviewed the evidence. The shadows don't match the supposed time of day, and I can identify at least 12 different editing artifacts. Someone with professional-grade software spent considerable time creating these images. The breakthrough came when Dr. Chen traced the original source photos to a stock photography website. Karen had purchased images of industrial equipment and digitally added explosive devices, creating the illusion of terrorist preparations that had never existed. The discovery prompted a federal investigation into the investigation itself, with uncomfortable questions about how such obvious fabrications had been accepted as credible evidence. As the digital forensics evidence mounted, other aspects of Karen's story began unraveling. Security camera footage from the locations where she claimed to have witnessed suspicious activity showed no signs of Jalen or anyone matching his description. Phone records contradicted her timeline of supposed terrorist communications. GPS data from Jalen's devices placed him at university lectures and community meetings, not clandestine bomb-making sessions. The revelation that shook the foundation of the entire case came from an unexpected source, Karen's own security system. In her arrogance, she had failed to consider that her home surveillance cameras would record her activities in the garage, where she staged the fake evidence photos. The footage showed her carefully arranging props and photographing them from multiple angles, creating the fictional terrorist threat that had crippled the nation's energy supply. FBI agent Patricia Reeves, who had initially led the investigation against Jalen, found herself in the uncomfortable position of investigating her own case. The evidence against Karen was overwhelming and deeply embarrassing for the Bureau, which had acted on her fabricated intelligence without sufficient verification. We followed protocol based on what appeared to be credible intelligence, Agent Reeves explained to her supervisors. But it's clear we were manipulated by someone with inside knowledge of our response procedures. This represents a massive intelligence failure on multiple levels. The media explosion that followed the revelation of Karen's deception threatened to overshadow even the original crisis. News outlets that had initially portrayed Jalen as a dangerous extremist now faced the uncomfortable task of explaining how they had been complicit in spreading fabricated terrorism accusations against an innocent man. CNN's Anderson Cooper led his evening broadcast with a stark acknowledgement. Tonight, we must address our role in spreading false information about Dr. Jalen Crawford. Our reporting, based on what we now know were fabricated federal sources, contributed to a narrative that destroyed this man's reputation and threatened his freedom. We owe him and our viewers a full accounting of how this happened. The economic damage continued mounting, even as the truth emerged. Restoring pipeline operations required extensive security checks and system verifications that took weeks to complete. The artificial fuel shortage had triggered panic buying of everything from generators to canned goods, creating secondary shortages across multiple sectors. Insurance claims related to the crisis reached into the hundreds of millions as businesses struggled with supply chain disruptions. Jalen's release from federal custody came with little fanfare, a stark contrast to the media circus surrounding his arrest. He walked out of the detention center wearing the same clothes he had been arrested in, his lawyer by his side, and a small group of supporters holding signs demanding justice. His first words as a free man were characteristically focused on the larger implications rather than his personal suffering. "This wasn't just an attack on me," he said, his voice steady despite the ordeal he had endured. "This was an attack on everyone who dares to challenge corporate power and advocate for environmental justice. If they can do this to me, they can do it to any of us." The investigation into Karen's activities revealed a conspiracy far more complex than simple market manipulation. Financial records showed she had coordinated with several other energy industry insiders to place strategic investments before triggering the crisis. Her scheme had generated over $200 million in profits for a network of shell companies and offshore accounts, making it one of the largest market manipulation cases in recent history. Karen's arrest came at the most ironic possible moment. She was attending the International Energy Forum in Geneva, Switzerland, delivering a presentation on crisis management in the modern energy sector, when Swiss police, acting on an international warrant, escorted her from the stage in handcuffs. The audience of industry executives and government officials watched in stunned silence as the woman who had positioned herself as an expert on managing energy crises was revealed as the architect of one of the most devastating artificial shortages in recent memory. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Swiss Federal Police Commander Hans Müller, "Ms. Whitfield is under arrest for international securities fraud, market manipulation, and conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism through false reporting. She will be extradited to the United States to face federal charges." The dramatic arrest, broadcast live to energy industry professionals worldwide, sent shockwaves through corporate boardrooms and government offices. The revelation that a respected industry spokesperson had weaponized terrorism, fears for profit, forced a reckoning with the vulnerabilities in both energy infrastructure protection and financial regulation. Karen's perp walk at Houston's federal courthouse drew hundreds of protesters and media representatives. Her designer business suit seemed incongruous with the federal marshals flanking her as she faced charges that could result in life imprisonment. The woman who had once commanded respect in corporate boardrooms now found herself reviled as a symbol of corporate greed run amok. The contrast with Jalen's treatment became a powerful symbol of systemic injustice. While he had been arrested at gunpoint in his pajamas for crimes he didn't commit, Karen was allowed to surrender voluntarily after making millions from actual criminal activity. The optics reinforced long-standing concerns about racial disparities in law enforcement and corporate accountability. Federal prosecutors, eager to restore credibility after the embarrassing intelligence failure, threw the full weight of the justice system at Karen and her co-conspirators. The indictment included charges of securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and making false statements to federal authorities. Additional terrorism-related charges were being considered given the national security implications of her actions. "This defendant didn't just steal money," declared U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh at the press conference announcing the charges. "She weaponized our national security apparatus for personal profit, endangering millions of Americans and undermining confidence in our critical infrastructure protection systems. We will seek the maximum penalties allowed by law." The civil lawsuits began filing within days of Karen's arrest. Class action attorneys representing everyone from individual drivers who couldn't get to work to major corporations affected by supply chain disruptions sought billions in damages. Pinnacle Energy Solutions, despite claiming ignorance of Karen's activities, faced regulatory investigations and congressional hearings that threatened the company's survival. CEO Richard Blackwood, who had praised Karen's crisis management just weeks earlier, now found himself testifying before hostile congressional committees about corporate oversight failures. The company's stock price collapsed as investors fled, and several major contracts were canceled by clients unwilling to be associated with the scandal. "We trusted Ms. Whitfield's expertise and credentials," Blackwood testified, his earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort. There was no indication that she was capable of such elaborate deception and criminal activity. "We are cooperating fully with all investigations and have implemented additional oversight procedures." The broader implications for the energy industry were profound. The ease with which Karen had manipulated both market forces and law enforcement exposed critical vulnerabilities in systems designed to protect national security and economic stability. Congressional hearings revealed that similar manipulation schemes might be occurring elsewhere, prompting calls for comprehensive reform of energy sector regulation. Senator Elizabeth Warren, leading the Senate investigation, pulled no punches in her criticism. This case demonstrates that we have allowed energy corporations to become so powerful that they can literally hold the American people hostage for profit. When industry insiders can fabricate terrorist threats to manipulate markets, we have failed in our most basic responsibility to protect the public interest. Meanwhile, Jalen's vindication opened doors that had been firmly closed before his ordeal. Universities that had quietly canceled speaking engagements during his legal troubles now competed to host him. Environmental organizations that had distanced themselves from his activism during the terrorism accusations now embraced him as a symbol of resilience against corporate persecution. The most significant recognition came from an unexpected source: the United Nations, impressed by Jalen's principled stance and the revelation of corporate attempts to silence environmental advocacy, invited him to address the upcoming Climate Action Summit in New York. The invitation represented not just personal vindication, but validation of the environmental justice movement more broadly. Dr. Crawford's experience represents the challenges faced by climate advocates worldwide, explained UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres in announcing the invitation. His courage in continuing to speak truth to power, even while facing false terrorism accusations, exemplifies the leadership needed to address our climate crisis. The Climate Summit address would become a defining moment in Jalen's career and the broader environmental movement. Standing before delegates from 193 countries, he spoke not with bitterness about his persecution, but with renewed determination to hold corporations accountable for environmental destruction. "They tried to silence me with lies," he declared, his voice carrying across the packed assembly hall. "They weaponized fear and prejudice to protect their profits. But the truth has power they cannot suppress. Climate change remains the greatest threat facing our species, and no amount of corporate manipulation will change that scientific reality." The standing ovation that followed his speech lasted nearly 10 minutes, with delegates from small island nations and climate-vulnerable countries leading the sustained applause. Video of his address went viral globally, inspiring a new generation of environmental activists and reinforcing the movement's momentum despite corporate efforts to undermine it. Karen's trial became one of the most closely watched corporate prosecution cases in recent memory. The evidence against her was overwhelming, but her defense team attempted to portray her as a scapegoat for broader industry practices. They argued that market manipulation was endemic in the energy sector, and that she was being prosecuted selectively for activities that were commonplace among her peers. The prosecution methodically demolished this defense by demonstrating the unique and extreme nature of Karen's scheme. Unlike typical market manipulation involving trading on insider information, she had created false national security threats that endangered public safety and undermined critical infrastructure operations. The defendant didn't just violate securities laws. Prosecutor Michael Torres explained to the jury, "She terrorized an entire nation to line her own pockets. She turned our own security apparatus against an innocent man based on fabricated evidence. This goes beyond corporate greed into the realm of domestic terrorism itself." The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Karen's composed facade finally cracked as the verdicts were read, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs as the reality of her situation became inescapable. Judge Patricia Hernandez, known for tough sentences in white-collar cases, scheduled sentencing for the following month. The sentencing hearing drew packed galleries as victims of Karen's scheme came to offer impact statements. Marcus Thompson, the construction worker who had missed his job interview due to fuel shortages, spoke about losing his apartment and struggling to support his family during the artificial crisis. "She didn't just steal money," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She stole opportunities, hope, and peace of mind from millions of people. My kids asked me why there was no gas, and I couldn't explain that someone would create suffering just to get richer." Jalen also spoke at the sentencing, but his statement focused on the broader implications rather than personal revenge. "The real tragedy isn't what happened to me," he said. "It's what this case reveals about how corporate power can corrupt our justice system and weaponize law enforcement against those who challenge their interests. We must ensure this never happens again." Judge Hernandez imposed the maximum sentence allowed under federal guidelines, 35 years in prison, plus restitution orders totaling over $400 million. The sentence sent shockwaves through corporate boardrooms nationwide, establishing a new precedent for accountability in cases involving market manipulation and false terrorism reports. "Your actions threatened the stability of our energy infrastructure, undermined public confidence in law enforcement, and caused immeasurable suffering to millions of Americans," Judge Hernandez said before imposing sentence. "This court finds no mitigating factors that would justify leniency in a case of such magnitude and callousness." The broader fallout continued for months after Karen's sentencing. Pinnacle Energy Solutions ultimately declared bankruptcy, unable to survive the combination of legal settlements, regulatory fines, and lost business. Several executives faced separate criminal charges for their roles in profiting from Karen's scheme, though none received sentences as severe as hers. The case prompted significant reforms in how federal authorities handle terrorism intelligence, with new verification procedures designed to prevent similar manipulation. The Securities and Exchange Commission implemented stricter oversight of energy sector trading, while Congress passed legislation increasing penalties for market manipulation involving critical infrastructure. Perhaps most importantly, the case became a catalyst for broader discussions about corporate power and environmental justice. Jalen's transformation from falsely accused terrorist to internationally recognized climate leader illustrated both the dangers of unchecked corporate influence and the resilience of truth in the face of powerful deception. On the first anniversary of his false arrest, Jalen stood once again on the steps of the Federal Energy Building in Houston. This time, the crowd numbered in the thousands, with supporters traveling from across the country to hear him speak. The contrast with his original modest protest was striking, demonstrating how attempts to silence truth can sometimes amplify it instead. "They thought they could destroy the movement by destroying me," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the crisp morning air. "But movements are bigger than any individual. Truth is more powerful than any lie, and justice, though delayed, will not be denied." The crowd's response was thunderous, but Jalen's message remained focused on the work still to be done. Climate change continued threatening the planet, while corporate interests continued prioritizing short-term profits over long-term survival. Karen's defeat was important, but it was only one battle in a much larger war. As the gathering dispersed and supporters returned to their communities across the country, they carried with them renewed determination to hold power accountable and demand action on climate change. Karen's attempt to silence the environmental movement had instead galvanized it, creating momentum that would drive policy changes and corporate accountability measures for years to come. The story's final chapter was still being written in courtrooms, corporate boardrooms, and legislative chambers nationwide. But the fundamental truth had been established: no amount of money or influence could permanently suppress justice when people were willing to stand up for what was right. Karen's spectacular fall from grace served as both a warning to other would-be manipulators and an inspiration to all those fighting for a more just and sustainable world. In his new office at the Environmental Justice Institute, which had been established with donations from supporters inspired by his story, Jalen continued the work that Karen had tried so desperately to stop. The walls were lined with awards and recognition from around the world, but he remained focused on the future rather than past victories. The phone rang constantly with requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and collaboration opportunities. Universities competed to recruit him for faculty positions, while environmental organizations sought his leadership on major campaigns. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from ordinary people whose lives had been touched by his story of perseverance and ultimate vindication. As the sun set over Houston's skyline, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jalen reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The false accusations, the months in detention, the public humiliation and fear. All of it had been transformed into something larger and more powerful than anything Karen could have imagined when she placed that fateful call to 911. The climate crisis remained urgent and overwhelming, but the movement to address it was stronger than ever. Corporate power still threatened democratic institutions and individual rights, but people were more aware and mobilized than before. And somewhere in a federal prison, Karen Whitfield served as a permanent reminder that those who abuse power in pursuit of profit will ultimately face the consequences of their actions. The story that began with sirens and terror ended with hope and determination, proving once again that truth, no matter how severely tested, has an enduring power that no amount of deception can ultimately overcome.